The Scum Villain's Self-Saving System, Chapter 24, Audio Source, wuxia-world-audiobook.com. Chapter 24. Tien, Su, Cliffy, Runs and Hides. Unedited. Kept, New Yuan Chan for the hairy female grudge demon spirit. Ghoul, just didn't sound quite right to me. New Yuan Chan was able to move by water and by land. After sucking the three people dry underwater, it couldn't wait to climb ashore to look for new targets. Luo Bing'er wasn't so easy to handle, however, his appearance towering and piercingly cold. He snapped his fingers and fire appeared at his fingertips, his spiritual power acting as the catalyst. He threw it at the sneaky monster. Once it came in contact with the hair, the flames quickly grew and fanned into a huge blaze, forcing the black strands of hair to quickly retreat back into the water, afraid to go ashore. The entire set of moves was carried through smoothly and successfully in one go at full power, without room for hesitation. In his heart, Shen Qingqiu was satisfied and he raised a placard, Luo Bing'er, 10 points. Luo Bing'er picked up Qin Wanyi's night pearl that had fallen to the ground and raised it high, as though it were a beacon. It awakened those who had frozen in place. He shouted, "Martial brothers and sisters, don't wander and get lost. Gather in one place and move together." Afterwards, he pulled out the standard Immortal Alliance conference item that everyone received, the emergency firework 1, and launched it towards the sky. The emergency fireworks were given to the disciples to use in case they came across monsters they had no way to confront. Generally, the Immortal Alliance Conference wouldn't release monsters that were too dangerous. Using it 3 times also resulted in an automatic wave. It was therefore used as a last resort during the Immortal Alliance Conference. Hardly anyone would use it. But at this moment, many bright fireworks bloomed over the entire sky of Judai Gorge, one after another. In the original work, this was a very beautiful scene. But now, these fireworks were not only far from being splendid. Instead, they made people feel as though their livers and gallbladders were being torn apart in grief and horror. Because every firework rising into bloom represented a disciple who was confronted with an extremely terrible monster, his or her life in danger. The crystal screens. Quickly look at the crystal screens. Tragic screaming and shouting broadcasted from the crystal screens without end. Some disciples had already died on the scene across rows of the crystal screens. Some disciples were still bathed in blood from fighting in close quarters, their eyes full of fear and dread. Why? Why does this place have? It shouldn't be like this. People, come and help. Poison Dragon Python 2. Shifu, save me. Elder Martial Brother, save. Suddenly, from within a crystal screen came a hoarse cry, the spirit eagles calling sadly and shrilly. Then the surface turned entirely black. Everyone said, "What's going on?" Shen Qingqiu felt his scalp turning numb, his tips of his fingertips ice cold. That hoarse cry must be the Demon Realm's Bone Eagle 3. It was a type of fierce and bloodthirsty flying monster. He was afraid that these spirit eagles had been torn apart by them and thrown onto the ground, likewise shattering the crystal screens on them into pieces. Swimming in the water, walking on land, or flying in the air. All were invaded by these frightening demonic creatures. Facing this kind of grand and chaotic scene, he truly didn't have a way to act as he originally planned and treat it as a realistic play, Rima and calm. And outside Judai Gorge, atop the high tower, it was as though a pot had exploded. The Taoists, 4, of Qianyi Overlook snapped. What's going on? The approved monsters for the Immortal Alliance Conference have all been chosen according to the strictest standards. How could a purely demonic thing like New Yuan Chan get mixed in? Several Wanhua Palace disciples had already died. The old palace head suddenly got up and in a trembling voice said word by word, "Open the enchantment." The great enchantment encompassing Judai Gorge was supported by several hundreds of Xiaohua temple monks. The Xiaohua temple abbot was quickly about to use the 1000-li transmitter to notify the monks to remove the enchantment. Who knew that Yue Qingyuan would suddenly say, "It cannot be opened"? The old palace head was stunned. Sect head Yue, what is the meaning of this? In Judai Gorge, there were many hundreds of Kangqiong sect disciples who participated in the Immortal Alliance conference. Yet Yue Qingyuan stopped them from opening the enchantment and letting the disciples trapped inside escape with their lives. Naturally, he had very important reasons for this. Shen Qingqiu said, "Once the enchantment is opened, it's true that the disciples can escape. But the monsters originally trapped inside will almost immediately flee. Within some li of distance, you can see smoke from human villages in this place. At that time, the situation would be even more grave. Our sect disciples have at least some ability to confront monsters. As for those normal, common people who don't have spiritual power flowing through their meridians." This remark made every one of the famous sect heads on the high platform unable to say nothing in reply and made him all silent. At a time like this, no matter how much of a great core formation or nascent soul cultivator you were still helpless against this kind of uncontrollable situation. Some people from Wanhua Palace seemed to have taken leave of their six senses and were at a loss. If the enchantment can't be opened to let them out, then what should be done? Shen Qingqiu said, "If exiting is impossible, then there can only be entering." Among Kangqiong Mountain sect members, many people met gazes in silent agreement. Yue Qingyuan said in a clear voice, "All fellow Taoists, today's events must be the intentional move of someone intending to borrow demon realm hands to eliminate our young cultivators and future pillars in one fell swoop. Because of their stratagem, we can only let the enchantment continue. I, their fellow Taoists who are willing to come along with my Kangqiong Mountain sect to enter the gorge to exterminate monsters and save the participating disciples. To kill a bloody path and clean up all the monsters required not only strength, but great courage." Wanhua Palace's old head was the first to respond. Wanhua Palace is duty-bound to assist in the Immortal Alliance conference this time. Wanhua Palace had the most participants and invested the most. They were the party most unable to bear it. With someone taking the lead, other people immediately followed closely behind and volunteered for the dangerous task. Even if there were those in the minority who were originally timid, they were now shocked awake as well. Their own talented baby disciples were in there, after all. Shen Qingqiu took one step forward and was just about to enter the queue of supporters when Lu Qingge blocked his path with his scabbard. Shen Qingqiu's expression didn't change as he used two fingers to push aside the scabbard. "What's the meaning of this?" Lu Qingge concisely and comprehensively said. "Your poison." Yue Qingyuan also used a voice only they could hear, 5 to say. "Correct. Qingqiu. You shouldn't forget, the remainder of the without a cure poison still hasn't been cleaned from your body. Give the safety of the King Jing Peak disciples to us to handle." Quote, there was one more sentence he hadn't spoken. What if after he entered Judai Gorge, he encountered an outbreak of the poison and his spiritual power was obstructed? Surrounded by many monsters, that would truly be like shouting every day without even an echo to answer for it. Shen Qingqiu shook his head and said, "With disciples who have encountered difficulties, how can the Shifu hide on the high platform and relax? Since when is there this kind of reasoning? If I'm unable to protect my own disciples, then I don't need to be the peak lord of my King Jing Peak anymore." Also, he was an important person for triggering the key scene. If he doesn't arrive at the scene, there's no way for things to proceed. Ding dong, the system alerted, through establishing a positive image early, making the villain a three-dimensional character, B points plus 30. In his heart, Xiāng Tóngxiù rolled his eyes. This counts as giving me sugar or morphine before stabbing me with a knife. Xiāng Yuan's advice for him not to go had no effect, so he could only reluctantly say, "Then you have to be careful. In the case you can't confront something, immediately contact us through the auditory technique so we can support you." Xiāng Tóngxiù wasn't as pessimistic about his own ability to deal with monsters as they were. Other than his confidence in his cultivation level and spiritual power, he also had one other additional bonus. Towards the monsters in proud immortal demon way, Xiāng Tóngxiù had a far greater interest in him than the different kinds of sisters. He might not be able to remember that female protagonist encountering a small grievance and going with Luo Bing'er to watch stars somewhere. That female protagonist's special flavor when doing the pa, or would sometimes even forget to match the name with the person, but he definitely remembered the properties and weaknesses of every monster absolutely clearly. If you really had to find something on him to hold up as a golden finger, then there was only this point. In Judai Gorge, Luo Bing'er was settling and calming down martial sisters and brothers whose souls seemed to have left their bodies and scattered, holding their ground. At a time like this, they absolutely couldn't scurry around in case a new monster emerged or people got lost again. It would only make the situation even worse. The night wind blew strongly. On four sides and from 8 directions came the ghostly, indeterminable sounds of humans or demonic creatures crying. Those who were less brave were already hugging their heads and weeping bitterly. Qin Wanyu's face was pale. WuxaWorldAudio.com. But upon seeing Luo Bing'er leaning against a tree with his Zhengyang sword propped up in his lap, vigilant and calm as he helped block the invasion of the dark for those by him, she couldn't help feeling warm honeyed sweetness threading into her heart. If Xiāng Tóngxiù were here, he would be very excited. "Sister, you've fallen in love with him." Gossiper's soul is burning. At this moment, a shi-shi-suo-suo sound poured from the woods. Luo Bing'er's gaze turned cold. Spiritual power gathered in the middle of his palm, ready to be used. From the underbrush, louder and louder, came the sound of something moving. As it came closer, people's hearts came up to their throats. Perhaps it was because they were already terrified to the limit, but no one cried out. Suddenly, there was a booming dong sound, like someone fell to the ground. Then, a round rolling thing rolled its way out of the underbrush. That was a human head. Both eyes in the head were closed, the face covered with blood, the hair as messy as a chicken's nest. This picture in the original novel was very frightening. But at a time like this, a dead person's head without any killing power was still better than a man-eating monster. Many people were relieved and let out their breaths. Qin Wanyu quaveringly said, This martial brother, does anyone know what sect he comes from?" Every disciple present drew close to identify the head, and all let out a breath in relief. "He isn't one of ours. Have never seen him before." Luo Bing'er looked towards the dark, black forest. In his mind, he thought, the head's here and the body must be nearby. I should go see his clothes and figure out which sect's disciple he is. He increased the spiritual power in his palm and walked towards the darkness. As expected, a stiff corpse lay behind the dark woods, wearing watery blue robes. It must be a Tianyi overlooked disciple. Luo Bing'er only saw the bottom hem of his robes, 6 before he sighed. This kind of disciple must have entered the Immortal Alliance conference to gain experience, only he wouldn't have thought he'd encounter an unexpected accident and give up his life. He continued looking upwards and was stricken with terror. Above this corpse's neck, there was still a perfectly good head attached. Then the head from earlier. Where did it come from? Luo Bing'e rapidly returned, Zheng Yang exiting its scabbard, white light like a flood as he shouted, "Get away from that head!" Those words had just been spoken when the head that had been peacefully lying crooked on the ground suddenly opened its eyes. Its angry eyes were round and beheld the many people. From somewhere below the neck, 8 long, thin, articulated and barbed spider legs emerged. It jumped up. It was too late for the closest person to avoid it, and it jumped onto his head. He yelled crazily and pulled out his sword and swung it wildly, as other people busily tried to avoid it. Luo Bing'e didn't dare to use his sword without a thought, in case he pierced not the creature but that person's head. The consequences would be disastrous. With such a frightening thing crawling all over his head, almost suffocating him, he was desperate and swung the sword around his own head, stabbing. But he hadn't even raised his hand when those 8 slim and narrow spider legs found their positions, inserting straight into his temples. That person's body immediately turned rigid. Even his tongue seemed to be tied into a knot, making him unable to shout a word. Under the human head, beneath the neck, the spider legs were inserted in deeper and deeper, causing the whole body to twitch. After a while, the 8 spider legs pulled out, leaving behind only 2 empty holes at that person's temples. Inside the cranial cavity, everything had been sucked away cleanly, absolutely empty. This scene was appalling. Even Luo Bing'e wasn't able to recover himself for a moment. That human-headed spider 7 creature, seeming to have sucked its fill of brain fluids, climbed up and down the body while emitting a shrill whistle, like a baby crying. Just at this moment, a light arrow condensed from spiritual power flew over, piercing through the mouth that was letting out long wails, beating this child that had forgotten itself in joy through to the correct answer. 8. In the abrupt silence and dazed shock of the people, Shen Xingqiu rubbed the ears that faintly hurt from all its shouting, adjusting his sleeves and appeared at the scene, low-key. Spreading his paper fan with a shake and holding it so that it covered half his face, Shen Xingqiu said with mild dislike, "How noisy." End chapter 24. 1. Emergency firework. Original translation would have been literally something like, "Help, call for help, firework." I thought about calling it, emergency flare, but that's not accurate because they don't have flare guns lol. 2. Poison dragon python. Translated this monster name literally. I think I got it right. 3. Bone eagle. Gu Ying in pinyin. Translated this literally. 4. Taoist. In case you don't know, Taoist is another way to call or address someone who's a cultivator. 5. Voice only. They could hear. High-level cultivators can speak telepathically, to an extent. I call this the auditory technique later. It's literally a technique. Lol. 6. Bottom hem of his robes. In case you don't know, sects, especially for disciples, have distinctive coloring styles for robes. They're like uniforms that double as company and job ID. And in this case, we can assume that disciple ranks, like outer versus inner, can be determined by the color of the robe ling. If you've read history's number 1 senior brother, it's like the system set up in Yan Zhaoji's sect. 7. Human-headed spider. Guessing this is species name. Pinyin is Rentu Zhiju. I'll leave it as human-headed spider. 8. Beating this child that had forgotten itself in joy. Referring to the baby spider. Yes, it's a baby spider. I think I translated this right, but this line gave me stitches. Original Chinese. Tien, PFFFT. How is that low-key? Shen Qingqiu smacks desk while laughing like a loon. End chapter.